Welcome, students. We're going to take some notes on the Civil War. We're going to focus more on the causes and the effects of the Civil War, not so much on the battles and the different workings of the Civil War. So let's begin. Compromise. Slavery was known as a necessary evil in early American history, and so many compromises were set up to bring balance to the spread of slavery as new states were added. And so you have compromises such as the Compromise of 1820 and later Compromise of 1850 that seek to kind of bring this sense of balance, if you will. Compromise of 1820 was very much of a new states in the North would be anti-slavery, and the new states in the South would be pro-slavery. So there was more of a focus on balancing the political nature of slavery, not as dealing with slavery as if it was morally right or morally wrong, but more of a compromise. In 1850, you start to see states choosing for themselves the issue of popular sovereignty, the issue of slavery. Popular sovereignty means let the states decide, and in most cases, let the states decide is very much of a libertarian and positive nature, which allows states to choose what's right for their state. For example, marriage laws and driving laws, DUI laws, gun laws. Those are things that are very personal to people and that are left up to the rights of the states versus the federal tyranny of a government. But on the issue of slavery, this sanctioned slavery so that slavery was not seen as morally wrong and therefore the federal government should get involved, but as just simply an issue like gun rights or drinking laws that should be left up to the states, which is a tragedy. So Congress allows states to choose for themselves on the issue of slavery. And this causes a lot of disagreement and violence and later a civil war. When a federal government will not deem an evil as evil, but just leave it up to the democracies, leave it up to the states to decide, to the people to decide, then that leads to violence. Then we have pro-slavery politics, such as the Fugitive Slave Act. This heightened laws and penalties on runaway slaves. And this is significant because the North used to be allowed to harbor runaway slaves and protect runaway slaves, and the abolition movement was big on that. The Underground Railroad, if you remember, started by Harriet Tubman and others, were able to smuggle slaves to the North to freedom. However, the Fugitive Slave Act would be a pro-slavery law by Congress that essentially makes us a slave state, where nowhere in America can you be free from slavery. And this is compounded by the Dred Scott case, which was a Supreme Court case in 1857, possibly one of the most important Supreme Court cases. I would say in the top 5, definitely, because this stated that slaves were property and not human. This ruled that there was no constitutional right to ban slavery. And so, in the interest of America trying to protect their civil liberties, so to speak, protection from the government telling slave masters what to do, it, in a sense, took away freedom from slaves, from African Americans, from blacks. And that's the problem here, is that when you focus so much on the freedoms and rights of one group, that takes away the freedoms and the rights of another group. And so you have to look at, in the issue of slavery, this was wrong, that allowing slave masters to have their freedom to own slaves took away the freedom from other people. As has been said by a poet, that your freedom exists in when you're punching somebody in the face, your freedom exists up until the point that your fist reaches their nose. And basically, you have the freedom to do what you want as long as it doesn't affect other people. And the abolition movement would be threatened by this court case. Some could compare this to the issue of abortion today, that women have the right to do with their body as they please, just like a slave master has the right to do what he pleases, as long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of the slave, as long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of the baby. but de facto you see how the freedoms, so to speak, do trump the rights of the marginalized, those who cannot speak for themselves, whether it's the slave or the unborn child. Violent conflicts, such as John Brown. This is known as Bleeding Kansas. John Brown and his sons started kind of a pre-Civil War against pro-slavery individuals. And so as Kansas is opening up the issue of popular sovereignty and people are moving to Kansas to vote in the election to see if it'll be a pro-slavery state or an anti-slavery state, he moves there as well and starts a violent crusade. And about 108 people would be murdered in this pre-Civil War Bleeding Kansas situation. He was known as the Jayhawkers in his group. The pro-slavery people were known as the Border Ruffians. The Jayhawkers is where the Jayhawk mascot comes from for Kansas University. You don't need to write down what's italicized, though. Harper's Ferry, he later storms to arm blacks for revolution. And so there's some people who advocate for revolution and overthrows of government that would be considered more Marxist, that see John Brown as kind of the true hero of the Civil War, as the one who would not use simply politics, but would use bloodshed to advance the cause of freedom for slaves. But the issue with this is that if you're just using revolution and bloodshed, is that there's never enough bloodshed, and that you start this legacy and history of bloodshed, as we've seen in communist areas that have focused on bloodshed as the catalyst for revolution and change and such, whereas Lincoln will use a different method. He would later be hanged for treason in Virginia because he had stormed the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in an attempt to free and to arm African Americans. As you can see, he's kind of a Moses figure, kind of leading blacks out of slavery. That was his focus. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party. The GOP was formed to limit the spread of slavery. Lincoln became the party's leading candidate. And so the GOP, the Grand Old Party, the Republican Party, initially was formed just to limit the spread of slavery. So it was more of a political issue, not so much of a moral issue. The Abolition Party, they saw slavery as more of an immoral issue, that we need to eradicate slavery. But the Republican Party early on was not into the eradication of slavery. And so Lincoln becomes the party's main candidate. By 1860, he wins the president's election. Without the South's representation. He only gets 40% of the popular vote, but he's able to win the specific states' electoral votes. The Confederate States of America then is formed, known as the CSA. 7 states would be formed due to slavery. So the first 7 states, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, they secede because of Lincoln's election, because they feel like he is going to threaten the institution of slavery, which is not what he had promised to do. The Republican Party had not promised to get rid of slavery. However, 4 more states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, they would join with the Confederacy after Lincoln sends troops on the South. So when people ask, is the Civil War about slavery? Well, about 7/11ths of the Civil War is about slavery. About 4/11ths of it is about Northern aggression, because there are 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, that do stay loyal to the Union. Even though they have slaves, they stay loyal to the Union. And so, yes, the Civil War is definitely about slavery, and that is the key, but it's also about this idea of Northern aggression. So you have people that have different perspectives on exactly which is more important. So as you see right here, the dividing line of the Civil War. So Civil War goal, preserve the Union. That was initially, the war was to bring back the South, and that was the key. And people attack Lincoln as very political and compromising with the issue of slavery, because he would have brought back the South even if he allowed slavery to still exist. However, at Gettysburg, he starts to send a different tone, that it's finally about ending slavery. no longer compromise with that evil of slavery. It's about freedom for all. And so he really starts this legacy of freedom, and that all men are created equal, and that it's important to use this opportunity of the Civil War and this bloodshed and this terrible Civil War as an opportunity to do the right thing. And he would. Reconstruction, that's the readmitting of southern states and freedom for blacks. However, Lincoln's Reconstruction ideas would not be carried out in full because of his assassination that will happen, and his running mate that he compromised with, his southern former slave-owning racist president Johnson, Andrew Johnson, would block much of that. So Congress institutes the Freedmen's Bureau. This helped former slaves in farming and education, which is a great start. But if you're simply teaching slaves to farm and educating them, but not giving them opportunities or property to do that with, then that becomes an issue. You don't need to write this down, but George Washington Carver is one of my most favorite individuals during this Reconstruction era. He's an African American who taught ex-slaves to plant nuts to help the depleted soil of the South. Because remember that the pro-slavery slaveholders, they not only were harming society with the slave issues, but also they were harming the geography because they were overplanting cotton, overplanting tobacco, and so it really depleted the soil. And so there was so much money to be had in cotton specifically that most slave owners were not crop rotating and protecting the environment. And so people like George Washington Carver would come along and present ways to use nuts to encourage white southern plantation owners to plant those nuts and to crop rotate instead of just keep depleting the soil. Really interesting. Congress institutes the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery. The 14th Amendment, which gives the right of citizenship to all. And then the 15th Amendment, which provides voting rights for males. Women will not get the voting rights until the 19th Amendment in 1920. But the 13th Amendment, that was Lincoln's real legacy, is his constitutional change to the Constitution. He adds that amendment to the Constitution, a change to the Constitution that puts in the Constitution that slavery is wrong. So this has far-reaching consequences. This is really an important amendment that he creates. This is so much bigger than John Brown's Bleeding Kansas and his revolt, because this really sets in stone in the Constitution that slavery is wrong. And we can go back to this and the rights of citizenship with the 14th Amendment that happens a year after his assassination, and the 15th Amendment that protects individuals, especially the marginalized, from any type of infringement of their political rights. However, President Andrew Johnson, as I mentioned before, a most racist president, overturns many of Congress's plans to help African Americans. For example, General William Tecumseh Sherman had promised African Americans that were freed after the Civil War 40 acres and a mule to be able to start out and to own land and to participate in politics, much like the white Europeans were able to do 200 years beforehand. However, Andrew Johnson, he just wants African Americans and blacks to just go back to the plantations, stay out of politics, so he overturns this, and this would have far-reaching consequences even to today. That property ownership is typically more of a Caucasian and European thing versus African American thing. The Ku Klux Klan, many Southerners would attempt to force blacks out of their communities and keep them from voting. So you also have the reign of terror that happens with the KKK. Now the KKK initially under President Grant was seen as a terrorist organization, as a negative thing. He waged the first war on terror against the Ku Klux Klan, not against jihadist extreme Muslims. However, because of scandals with Grant's presidency, he would not continue that war on terror and protect blacks. So blacks pretty much were to fend for themselves. Southern states also found many loopholes to keep African Americans from voting, such things as poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. So again, we see how Andrew Johnson right here in his lack to protect African Americans, and even Grant, his enduring legacy of scandals, really keeps African Americans from getting the help that they needed. So some would say that African Americans were worse off after the Civil War than during the Civil War or during slavery. Yes, slavery was a terrible thing, but to simply give African Americans de facto or de jure rights, but not allow them to have de facto rights, they would be even in more fear for their lives, because the federal government would, in a sense, promise things but not deliver. Compromise of 1877, Republicans get a pro-business president. And this is where the Republican Party goes from being known as the anti-slavery, the anti-spread of slavery party, to the business party, which is what the Federalists had always been, kind of more of the pro-business party. And so Hayes would become president in this controversial election, and the Democrats would get an end to Reconstruction. And so that's a ceasing of congressional reforms in the South and also removal of Union troops from the South. You don't need to write those two sub-points down. But basically, this is the point where Republicans start turning their backs on African Americans to focus on business, because Republicans felt like at this time that it was too costly to protect African Americans. And so they just allow the South to kind of revert back to pre-Civil War racism and segregation that will continue until the 1960s. Really sad moment right here where Republicans start to kind of alienate or not really focus on the social needs of African Americans anymore. They had done a great job for 12 years of protecting African Americans and pushing through amendments in Congress, but really by 1877 there's this switch that happens. So thank you for taking these notes. Make sure to submit them.